The bride's father stood up from the front pew of my son's wedding, straightened his silk tie, looked at me across a hall he had decorated in white hydrangeas and gold ribbon, and said, "We don't accept poor in-laws in this family. I'm going to ask you, respectfully, to leave before the ceremony begins." The hall went silent. Not the soft pre-ceremony silence of polite strangers settling into chairs, but the hard, full-bodied silence of 200 people suddenly aware that they were witnesses to something they had not come here to witness. A woman in the third row set down her program. A man near the back coughed once and then held very still. The string quartet tuning in the corner stopped mid-phrase. Arlen Kellogg Voss. That was his name, and he was 60 years old and a head shorter than me and had been rehearsing the sentence in his head for weeks, stood in his charcoal tuxedo with his hand resting lightly on the back of the pew, the way a captain rests his hand on the wheel of a ship he is certain he owns. Around him, his side of the aisle held the men and women he had invited to witness his performance, country club members, hospitality industry peers, a few local television personalities, the mayor of one of the smaller Twin Cities suburbs. They were the audience he had assembled. I was the actor he had decided to write out of the script. I looked at my son. Preston was standing at the altar in a tuxedo I had paid for. He was 29 years old. He was the only child of my late wife, Carolyn, who had died 4 years earlier from a cancer that did not have the courtesy to take its time. He was standing beside a pastor I had also paid for, though no one at this wedding knew that, because Arlen had insisted on handling the arrangements as a point of pride, and I had quietly covered the shortfall 3 weeks earlier when Arlen's deposit check bounced, and the venue threatened to cancel. My son looked at me, and he nodded. Not a big nod. Not an enthusiastic one. A small, tight, agreeing nod. The nod of a young man who had already convinced himself that his father was an embarrassment and was grateful to someone else for having the courage to say so out loud. I did not speak. I did not argue. I did not explain to this roomful of strangers that the suit I was wearing, which Arlen had ridiculed at the rehearsal dinner the night before, was a Hart Schaffner Marx I had bought in 1997 when my son was 6 years old, and that I still wore it because Carolyn had been with me when I bought it, and that some things in a man's life are worth more than what they cost. I stood up from the back pew where Arlen had reseated me that morning. The note had read in his precise handwriting, "We've had to adjust some seating for family balance. Thank you for understanding." And I buttoned my jacket the way my father had taught me to, one button from the bottom, and I walked out of the Summit Atrium Event Hall with the calm and unhurried pace of a man who had just been handed a gift he had not been expecting and did not want, but could, if pressed, put to use. In the lobby, I took out my phone. I called my chief operating officer, a woman named Adaeze Obasanjo, who had been with me for 14 years and who never sleeps past 5 a.m. on Saturdays because her husband is a pastor and her mornings belong to God. "Eddie's," I said. "Do you have a minute?" "Always, Wendell," she said. "2 things," I said. "First, the Summit Atrium deal. I need you to accelerate the closing. Not Monday. Today, if the Sellers Council will move on it. Second, I want you to pull the file on Kellogg Voss Hospitality Group. All 3 of our notes. I need to know our exposure and what triggers we have available under the loan covenants." There was a short silence on the other end of the line. The kind of silence Adaze uses when she has already understood everything I have not said. "Wendell," she said, "is this personal?" "It's business," I said. "It became business about 90 seconds ago." "I'll be at the office by noon," she said. "I'll have answers by 3. "Thank you," I said, and I walked out of the Summit Atrium into a bright October afternoon in suburban Minneapolis, with the trees doing their final, stubborn work of being gold before the cold came in. And I drove home. Before I tell you what happened at dessert, how a 61-year-old real estate investor from St. Paul, Minnesota, ended a Saturday that had started with public humiliation by owning the venue, the catering company, and the business of the man who had humiliated him. I want to offer a gentle reminder. Some elements of this story have been dramatized for the telling, but the lessons about family, respect, and the weight of our choices remain deeply real. The worst insults in this life are not delivered by strangers. They are delivered most of the time by the people you raised, in rooms you paid for, in front of audiences who will never know what it took to stand up and walk out without raising your voice. And before we go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. What city, what country, what time it is where you are. It helps this channel reach the people who need to hear stories like this, and it reminds me that even on the Saturdays when your own son nods along while a stranger tells you to leave, there is a whole world of quiet, decent people listening with you. My name is Wendell Mayfield. I'm 61 years old. I was born in Mankato, Minnesota, to a father who worked 41 years at a meatpacking plant and a mother who took in sewing from the neighbors to keep the family above water. We lived in a 2-bedroom rental on the east side of town, and I shared a bedroom with my younger brother until I was 17. My father came home every night smelling of industrial disinfectant and cold concrete, and he never once complained about his work, because complaining was not in his vocabulary the way violin is not in mine. He did what he did. He fed his family. He died of emphysema at 63, and I have spent the 4 decades since trying to be half the man he was without the benefit of his silence. I went to the University of Minnesota on academic scholarships and a night job loading freight at a trucking depot in Bloomington. I studied finance because I had grown up watching my parents negotiate with the world from a position of weakness, and I wanted to understand the systems that decided who had power and who did not. I graduated in 1986. I took a job at a small commercial real estate firm in St. Paul. I worked there for 9 years, and I learned the shape of the business from the inside. How commercial property is bought and sold, how loans are structured, how a building that looks healthy can be hollowed out from within by a balance sheet, and how a building that looks broken can be worth more than anyone knows if you understand what is wrong with it. In 1995, I started my own firm, Mayfield Capital Partners. I had $72,000 in savings and a small office above a dry cleaner on University Avenue. My first deal was the acquisition of a distressed industrial park in Roseville that 3 larger firms had passed on. I bought it for 62 cents on the dollar and spent 18 months turning it around. I sold it in 1999 for more than twice what I had paid. That one deal gave me the capital to do 2 more. 2 gave me 4. 4 gave me 16. Within a decade, Mayfield Capital Partners was one of the most active private investment firms in the upper Midwest, specializing in a specific kind of transaction: distressed commercial assets, closely held family businesses with succession problems, and regional hospitality chains that had grown faster than their management could sustain. By the time my son Preston was in high school, my firm was managing over $600 million in assets under management and owned, partially or fully, 78 separate businesses across 11 states. I never told Preston any of this. That is important for you to understand. I did not hide it, but I did not perform it. I drove the same 2008 Volvo for 15 years. I lived in the same 3-bedroom colonial in Highland Park that Carolyn and I had bought in 1998. I bought my suits at Hart Schaffner Marx because they lasted and I liked the way they fit. I ate lunch most days at a diner called Mickey's in downtown St. Paul, where the coffee is bad and the hash browns are perfect. My father had taught me, without ever saying it, that a man's worth is not something he announces. It is something he is, with or without witnesses. Carolyn understood this. Carolyn had been raised by a mother who cleaned houses for wealthier families in Edina, and she had spent her entire adult life alert to the difference between people who had money and people who needed to tell you about it. We raised Preston in a house where we did not discuss the scale of what I did. He knew I worked in real estate. He knew we were comfortable. He did not know. And we made a deliberate choice that he would not know until he was old enough to understand money as a tool rather than an identity. What the full shape of my business looked like. This was, I have come to understand in the years since Carolyn's death, a mistake. Not because I wish Preston had known how wealthy I was, but because by protecting him from that knowledge, I also failed to teach him how to recognize contempt when it was directed at someone who looked like me. Carolyn died in August of 2021. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by summer. 5 months from the day we walked into the oncologist's office to the day I buried her at Resurrection Cemetery under a headstone that has both our names on it, with the second date still open, the way these things are done for the spouse who is left behind. Preston was 25 when his mother died. He was already living in Minneapolis, working as an associate at a management consulting firm downtown. He handled the loss the way many young men handle loss. Badly at first, then by throwing himself into work, and then, about a year in, by falling hard for a woman he believed would replace what he had lost. The woman was Kennedy Kellogg Voss. She was 26. She was the only daughter of Arlen Kellogg Voss, CEO of Kellogg Voss Hospitality Group, which owned the Summit Atrium Event Hall, Kellogg Voss Gourmet Events Catering, 2 boutique hotels in Stillwater, and a chain of 4 restaurants in the western suburbs. Kennedy was pretty, polished, well-educated, and, at the time Preston started dating her, exactly the kind of woman who looked to a grieving young man like a whole family waiting to be joined. I met Kennedy 6 months into their relationship. She was perfectly polite. She made appropriate conversation. She asked me what I did, and Preston, before I could answer, said, "Dad's in real estate." And Kennedy smiled and moved the conversation to her father's vacation home in Sedona. I remember noticing the smoothness of the redirection. I did not say anything. I had been in business long enough to know when I was being assessed and found unworthy of further inquiry, and I had learned from Carolyn that it was unwise to prove people wrong unless you had a reason. I did not have a reason. Not then. I met Arlen Kellogg Voss 3 months later at a Sunday brunch at his house in North Oaks, a 5,000-square-foot French country home on a private lake, with 3 separate garages and a wine cellar he insisted on showing me. Arlen was the kind of man who introduces himself with both his names and who assumes you have heard of him. He had not heard of me. He had not done any research because I was, in his estimation, Preston's father. A retail quantity, not a wholesale one. Arlen spent most of that brunch performing. He told stories about deals he had closed. He named venues he had opened. He mentioned his membership at 3 different clubs. He asked me, at one point, where I golfed, and when I told him I didn't, he looked at me for a half-second longer than was polite, and then said, "Well, Wendell, a man's got to have a hobby," and then moved on. I watched my son during that brunch. I watched Preston absorb Arlen's performance the way a dry sponge absorbs water. I watched him laugh at Arlen's jokes too loudly. I watched him agree with Arlen's opinions too quickly, and I watched him at one point look at his own father the way a man looks at a piece of luggage that he realizes is the wrong color for the trip he's about to take. That was the first moment I understood what was happening. My son, in his grief, had decided to trade his family for the illusion of a bigger one. And Arlen Kellogg Voss had decided, with the smooth instinct of a man who had made a career out of finding people who needed to be told who they were, to accept that trade. Have you ever watched someone you raised begin to be ashamed of you in real time? Not over something you did, just over who you are? If you've lived inside that particular grief, tell me about it in the comments. I want you to know you're not the only one who sat across from a son who used to look at you like you hung the moon, and realized he has started to look at you like you are blocking his view of somebody else's moon. The engagement was announced that following spring. The wedding was set for October. Arlen insisted on handling the arrangements. The venue was his own summit atrium, the catering was his own company, and the guest list was primarily his business contacts. Preston agreed to every decision. I was not consulted on any of it. I was asked, 2 weeks before the wedding, whether I would like to say a few words at the reception. I said I would. I was told, 4 days later, that the program had been reorganized and there would not, unfortunately, be time. At the rehearsal dinner the night before the wedding, Arlen made a joke about my suit. He said across a table of 26 people at a private dining room in one of his own restaurants in Wayzata that he appreciated that I had dressed up for the occasion and that he hoped my Hart-Schaffner marks had seen me through many important events over the years. The table laughed. Preston laughed. Kennedy looked at me for a moment with something that might have been sympathy, or might have just been the well-trained face of a young woman who has been taught not to contradict her father in public. I did not react. I ate my meal. I complimented the chef on the risotto, which was genuinely excellent. I thanked the server. I made polite conversation with the woman seated to my left, who turned out to be Arlen's sister-in-law, and who asked me twice what I did for a living, and twice received the answer I always gave, I work in real estate, and twice nodded politely and moved on. At one point during dessert, I watched my son across the table as Arlen told a long, rehearsed story about a deal he had closed with a hotel chain in Wisconsin. Preston was laughing in all the right places. He was leaning forward. He was nodding. He was the very picture of a young man absorbing wisdom from a mentor. And I watched him and I thought, Carolyn, if you were here, what would you say to him? Would you have found a moment alone with him, sometime between the appetizers and the coffee, and said, Preston, look at your father. Look at what he is choosing not to say tonight. That is the man I married. That is the man who raised you. Look at him while he is still here to be looked at. But Carolyn was not there. Carolyn had been gone for 3 years and 2 months, and the conversation I was imagining was a conversation she could no longer have. My son was going to have to find his own way to it, or he was not going to find his way to it at all, and either outcome was going to be his choice, not mine. I went back to my hotel and took off the suit. The same suit Carolyn had chosen with me in 1997, in a men's store in downtown Minneapolis, when Preston was 6 years old and sitting on a leather bench, flipping through a catalog of cufflinks he couldn't yet read, and I hung it carefully in the closet. And I thought, Carolyn, I'm glad you are not here to see this. Then I thought, no, I'm sorry you are not here. You would have known what to do with Preston. I have not known what to do with him since you left, and he has gotten very far from us in a very short time. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, and I let myself miss Carolyn the way I had not let myself miss her in months. Not the way you miss a person at a funeral, which is sharp and shared, but the way you miss them at a family event they should have been at, which is quieter and more private and in some ways worse. I thought about the ways she had protected Preston from the harder edges of the world. I thought about the ways she had protected me from the harder edges of my own success. Carolyn had been the translator between my life and our family's life, and with her gone, Preston had begun to mistake the surface of things for the whole of them. I slept badly. I woke at 5. I showered, dressed in the same suit, and drove to the summit atrium at 11 the next morning, because a man shows up to his son's wedding even when he suspects his son has lost his way. You show up. You sit in whatever seat they've assigned you. You wish your child the best. You hope, the way every parent hopes that the vows they are about to take will grow them into a better version of themselves. I did not expect Arlen to stand up and ask me to leave before the ceremony. I did not expect it, but I was not surprised. Men like Arlen build toward moments like that one for weeks in their heads, and once the performance has been written, it demands to be delivered. What Arlen did not know, what he had never bothered to research because research required him to see me as something other than furniture, was the shape of my business. He did not know, for example, that his family's primary wealth was tied up in a hospitality company that had been over-leveraged since 2019, that had survived the pandemic only by borrowing heavily against its real estate holdings, and that had, over the past 18 months, come onto the radar of several distressed asset investment firms in the upper Midwest. One of those firms was mine. He did not know that Mayfield Capital Partners had, over the previous 6 quarters, quietly acquired 3 loan positions from the regional banks that had originally financed Kellogg Voss Hospitality Group's expansion. We had purchased the notes at a discount because the bank wanted them off their books. We had done it through a blind limited partnership, a standard legal structure, which meant the name Mayfield did not appear anywhere in Arlen's paperwork. His CFO knew only that 3 of his loans had been sold to an LP called Summit Crossing Holdings. Arlen had not asked who Summit Crossing Holdings was. He had assumed it was an insurance company or a pension fund. It was, in fact, a wholly owned subsidiary of my firm. He also did not know that the Summit Atrium Event Hall, the venue at which he was currently hosting his daughter's wedding, had been on the market for 6 months. Its parent company, a mid-sized commercial hospitality group based in Chicago, had been losing money on the property and was looking for a buyer. Mayfield Capital had been in final stage negotiations for 3 months. Closing was scheduled for Monday. A signed purchase agreement was sitting on Adiza's desk at that very moment. I had already wired the earnest money. These were the facts I carried with me as I walked out of the Summit Atrium at 12:17 on the afternoon of Saturday, October 14th. I made one phone call. Adiza answered on the second ring. I told her what I needed. I hung up. Then I drove home. I want to tell you what I did next because I think it is the most important part of this story, and it is not the part most people expect. I did not drive to my office and begin plotting revenge. I did not call a newspaper. I did not call Preston. I did not call anyone at the wedding. I drove home, and I walked into the kitchen of the house Carolyn and I had bought 26 years earlier, and I sat down at the kitchen table and I made myself a sandwich, turkey and Swiss, on rye bread. I ate it slowly. I drank a glass of water. I looked out the window at the maple tree in the backyard, which was turning the deep red it turns every October, and I thought about Carolyn. If Carolyn had been there, she would have said, "Wendell, sit with it. Sit with what just happened to you. Don't reach for the phone. Don't reach for the wound. Just sit." So I sat. I sat at that kitchen table for 40 minutes. I thought about my son. I thought about the 6-year-old boy on a leather bench in a men's store in 1997. I thought about the 17-year-old who had asked me, the night before he left for college, whether I thought he was going to be successful. I thought about the 25-year-old who had stood beside me at his mother's grave with tears on his face and his hand in mine. I thought about the 29-year-old who had just nodded while a stranger asked me to leave his wedding. All of those people were the same person. That was the hard part. The boy was still in there. He had just, somewhere along the way, somewhere in the particular grief of losing his mother, decided to trade his whole family history for the approval of a louder, shinier, emptier family. And I had let him because I had not known how to stop him without becoming the kind of father who demands to be seen. A man should not have to demand to be seen by his own son. The demand itself is the loss. At 1:45, Adiza called. "Wendell, she said. "The Summit Atrium closing. The Sellers Council is prepared to close by 4 p.m. today if we can wire the balance. They're desperate. It's a fire sale." "Wire it," I said. "And the Kellogg-Voss positions?" "Tell me what I own." 3 promissory notes totaling $14.6 million. The notes are secured by first-position liens against the Summit Atrium property, the Stillwater Hotel properties, and the company's primary operating accounts. Our loan covenants require minimum debt service coverage ratios that Kellogg-Voss has been violating for the past 2 quarters. We have the legal right to declare default, accelerate the balance, and appoint a receiver at any time. We've been holding off because we were waiting for the right strategic moment to either restructure the debt into equity or force a sale. "I see," I said. "What's your recommendation?" Adaize was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Wendell, I've worked for you for 14 years. I've never once seen you make a business decision out of emotion. If you're asking me whether we should move on Kellogg-Voss today, I'll do what you ask. But I want you to tell me first what you actually want." I closed my eyes. I thought about Preston. I thought about Carolyn. I thought about my father, who had worked 41 years at a meatpacking plant and never, in all that time, raised his hand or his voice against anyone. "I want Arlen Kellogg-Voss out of the leadership of his own company," I said. "I want him to understand, in a way that cannot be argued with, that the things he told himself about me were not true. I do not want to destroy his business. I do not want his employees to lose their jobs. I do not want his daughter to lose her home or her stability. I want him, specifically, him, personally, removed from the position he believed gave him the right to humiliate my son's father at my son's wedding." "Understood," Adaize said. "I want you to prepare a restructuring proposal," I continued. "We declare default on Monday morning. We offer the company a debt-for-equity swap that gives us majority control. We keep all employees. We keep the brand names intact for the first 12 months. We remove Arlen as CEO as a condition of the restructuring. We replace him with his COO, Jessica Navarre, who I met at an industry event 2 years ago and who struck me as the only competent executive in that organization. We give Arlen a modest severance and a non-compete." "Wendell," Adaize said, her voice careful, "that is more mercy than most men in your position would extend." "I know," I said, "but I'm not most men, and I'm not going to become one today. Send me the paperwork for review tonight." I hung up the phone. I sat at the kitchen table for another hour. At 4:03 in the afternoon, Adaize sent me a text. "Summit Atrium closing complete. You are now the sole owner of the property at which your son is currently having his reception. I did not go there. I did not drive back to the Summit Atrium. I did not crash the reception. I did not stand at the back of the room while my son cut his wedding cake and announced that I owned the floor he was standing on. I want you to understand, because I think this is the part that matters most. I did not do it because I had already decided, at that kitchen table with the maple tree turning red outside the window, that I was not going to become the kind of man who did those things. My response to being told I was not welcome in a hall was not going to be to stand in that hall and tell everyone in it who they had been wrong about. That would have made me exactly what Arlen accused me of being, a small man announcing his size. Instead, I made dinner. I ate alone. I watched an old Western on television. I went to bed at 9:30 and slept better than I had slept in 6 months. The rest of the story happened the way the rest of stories tend to happen when the quiet structures have already been built. Slowly, inevitably, without drama. Monday morning at 8:15, Adaize's team delivered the formal notice of default to Kellogg-Voss Hospitality Group. Arlen's CFO, a man named Douglas Penrose, received it. He called Arlen. Arlen, who was still in Aruba on the first day of his daughter's honeymoon trip, The Kellogg Voss had flown there with Preston and Kennedy for a family celebration the day after the wedding, did not believe what he was being told. He spent the next 6 hours on the phone with lawyers before he accepted that the call was real. By Tuesday afternoon, it was in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. Mayfield Capital Partners moves to acquire Kellogg Voss Hospitality in accelerated debt restructuring. On Tuesday evening at 7:30, my cell phone rang. The number was my son's. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. "Dad," Preston said. His voice was tight, strained. The voice of a young man who had just seen his new father-in-law return from his honeymoon early in a panic, screaming on phone calls in the hotel lobby, and had just, within the past hour, read the news article and connected a set of dots he had not previously known existed. "Dad," he said again. "Is it true?" "Is what true?" I asked. That you're the one that you own Mayfield Capital? That you bought the atrium on Saturday? That you're taking over Arlen's company?" "All true," I said. He was silent for a long time. I could hear him breathing. I could hear in the background a woman's voice that might have been Kennedy's, upset, pleading for information. "Dad," he said finally, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I did not think it should matter," I said. "I did not think the size of my business should be the thing that told you who your father was. I thought for a long time that the man you saw every day would be enough." There was another silence, longer than the first. When he spoke again, his voice had cracked. "Dad," he said, "I'm sorry." I sat in my chair at the kitchen table, the same chair I had sat in on Saturday. The maple tree outside the window had lost more of its leaves now, and the October wind was rattling them against the glass. "Preston," I said, "I love you. I will always be your father. But I want to tell you something, and I want you to listen to it the way you would listen to your mother if she were here." "Yes," he said. His voice was very small. "You did not nod at the wedding because you believed I was poor," I said. "You nodded because, somewhere along the way, you decided that you needed a family that was louder than the one you had. You let another man humiliate your father in public, and you agreed with him, because agreeing with him felt safer than defending me. That is the thing I want you to understand. Not that you were wrong about my wealth. That you were wrong about what your job was in that room. Your job in that room was not to calculate which family was bigger. Your job in that room was to be my son. He was crying now. I could hear it. I am not going to punish you for what happened Saturday," I continued, "but I am not going to pretend it did not happen either. You and I are going to have to rebuild the trust between us slowly, and we are going to rebuild it through your actions, not your words. I will be here. I will answer your calls. I will come to dinner when you invite me, but the father you had before Saturday is not the father you have now, and you are going to have to earn him back. Dad," he said, "I will. I promise." "I know you will," I said, "because you are Carolyn's son as much as you are mine, and your mother did not raise a man who would not do the hard work." We hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for another hour. The restructuring of Kellogg Voss Hospitality Group closed the following month. Arlen was removed as CEO. Jessica Navarre, whom I had promoted as I had planned, took over and did a better job than Arlen had done in 20 years. The company retained all 743 employees. The Stillwater hotels were kept open. The restaurants remained in operation. The brand names survived, though the venue division was quietly rebranded the following year under a new name, one that made no reference to any family. Arlen retired to a smaller house in Wayzata. I understand he does not go out much anymore. He is not a man who handles a diminished stage well. I have never spoken to him since that Saturday. I do not need to. Some men explain themselves, some men do not. The choice of which to be is perhaps the most important choice a man ever makes. Preston and Kennedy are still married. They are not happy in the way I had hoped they would be, but they are trying, and I have learned at my age that trying is more than most people manage. Kennedy, to her credit, has become a different person in the past year. She does not look like her father anymore. She looks like a woman who is deciding what she wants to believe about the world, and who her father's worst moments cannot be the final word on that. I think she will come into her own. Preston visits me for dinner twice a month. We do not always talk about what happened. We talk about the twins. We talk about his work. We talk about his grandmother, my mother, who passed when Preston was very young and whom he barely remembers. Slowly, the way all important things are built, we are rebuilding something. It will not be what it was before Carolyn died, but it may eventually be something honest. I still wear the Hart Schaffner Mark suit. I wore it to my mother's funeral in 1998, to Carolyn's funeral in 2021, and to my son's wedding in 2024. I will wear it until it falls off me, and then I will buy another one like it, because some things in a man's life do not need to be upgraded in order to be the best version of themselves. If you are listening to this, and you have ever been told in a room full of people that you are not enough, not wealthy enough, not successful enough, not impressive enough, I want you to hear this. Your worth is not established by the people who decide to insult you. It is established by the choices you make in the minutes after they do. You can walk out of that room with your pride intact. You can make the one phone call you need to make. And you can spend the rest of your evening making yourself a sandwich, because a man who has lived a careful life does not need to respond to an insult with anything louder than silence and a signed purchase agreement. I do not hate Arlen Kellogg Voss. I do not love him either. He is a man who built his identity on the fragility of other people's self-regard, and in the end, the only thing he lost was access to the company he had stopped running well years before Saturday. I did not destroy him. I simply stopped protecting him from the consequences of his own weakness, and removed him from a position he had already failed to deserve. As for my son, I am his father. I will be his father until the day one of us is buried beside Carolyn. I do not require his apology to keep loving him. I require his steady, imperfect, ongoing effort to be the kind of man his mother and I raised him to be. That is the only debt he owes me, and he is paying it, one Sunday dinner at a time. Thank you for spending your time with us here at the Otis Archive. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice.